himself by presenting his work. Um, so he is Dr. Ryan Anningson is the current Flora Jane Baker Postdoctoral Fellow here at the School of Religion, and he did his PhD at Wilfrid Laurier. His dissertation title was Theories of the Self, Race, and Essentialization in Buddhism, the U.S. and the Asian Other, 1899 to 1957. Um, and he will be, I think it's important for us to know, there might be some students in the audience that he will be teaching a course during the spring term, RELS 201, and the title is Race and Colonialism in Religious Studies. So it should be a really interesting course. And if you're shopping for a course in spring term, I think that would make a great option. You'll hear a little bit about his work today, and hopefully that'll whet your appetite for more. So Ryan has joined our community, at least the virtual community, online, and I'm really delighted to welcome him. Please join me in welcoming him, and I'll turn things over to him to get started.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
I think if you could boost
Sounds
your volume a bit, that might help me. Maybe I just need to boost mine. I don't know, but
okay. Turn up a little bit here.
that's
All
great.
right. Excellent. Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming, especially to those from outside of the Queen's community. Let me begin by thanking Dr. Adnan Hussein and the School of Religion here at Queen's for inviting me to speak with you this afternoon, as well as thank Alison Gowenlock for help with the poster and advertisements, as well as the technology with today's presentation. I will be speaking to you today about my research, which is currently becoming my forthcoming book, published with Routledge Press, titled Theories of the Self, Race, and Essentialization in Buddhism, the United States and the Asian Other, 1899 to 1957. My research is based on Buddhist publications written in English, distributed throughout a transnational network, mainly focusing on the United States. In the late 1890s, Buddhist groups began publishing monthly magazines to explain the religion for European and American audiences. I analyzed these Buddhist magazines from the United States, Japan, and South Asia, as well as the cultural and ideological situation of America at the time. The title of my talk today is Race Sciences and the Aryan Race in American Buddhism. I also sometimes present my research to people as the Aryanization of Buddhism. The history shows the adaptations Buddhists made to their religion in the face of colonialism and racism, coupled with 2 world wars. We will see that through the utilization of racism and racecraft, Buddhists were able to fit themselves within American frameworks and position Buddhism as a religion of scientific and spiritual superiority. This research should nuance discussions of Buddhism and science, as well as Buddhist modernism, and now even Buddhist postmodernism. I begin my talk with a painting called Peoples of Europe, Guard Your Most Sacred Possessions from 1895. The picture is meant to be an allegory with each nation of Europe represented, and they're being warned by the angel Gabriel against the oncoming danger. That danger is represented by the Buddha, who's riding a dragon and surrounded by fire. This is a representation of the oncoming scourge of the yellow peril and the religion of gloom and melancholy known as Buddhism. My historical time period, 1899 to 1957, is defined by colonialism and racism. This is the progressive era in the United States, leading into World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. I will delve into more detail about the American cultural milieu during this time period in just a second, but the most important factor to remember is that race sciences, or scientific racism, was the most en vogue and cutting-edge science of the day. For ideology and race creation, scientific racism was not simply the work of quacks and frauds, but was placing scientific validity on long-held beliefs about supremacy and inferiority. This is the era of colonialism. By 1910, nearly 90% of the world was under some colonial control. This means that Buddhists were directly related to colonialism in some form or fashion, which would definitely color the spin they put on Buddhism during this time period. In other words, Buddhists living in colonized nations used race in a specific way, whereas Buddhists living in imperial nations presented racial supremacy in a different way. In all cases across Asia during this time period, the supposed science of racism was being utilized to justify and supplant ideologies of supremacy and inferiority. I begin today by defining a couple of terms, namely racecraft and bioracism. Racecraft comes from the comparative racial theorist Karen Fields and Barbara Fields. Fields and Fields actually used the work of E. Evans Pritchard in his study of Azande witchcraft. In this work, Pritchard describes the importance of witchcraft in all matters of Azande society, claiming witchcraft has an internal logic, is the purview of specialists with their own internal codes, and it holds deep, powerful meanings for those involved. Fields and Fields posit that racecraft is therefore more than bald racism because it is shaped by culture and also helps to shape it. Racecraft is not necessarily the outwards discrimination and violence of racism. It is also present through American culture, societal rules, and laws. The era I am discussing in American history has been labeled as the age of the eugenics craze. America was a global leader in the developing fields of phrenology, eugenics, craniology, and degenerate studies. Previously, the terms race sciences or scientific racism have been used, but these both maintain some sense of scientific fact. Race is simply not based in scientific fact. Instead, as we can see through the combination of racecraft, what was actually produced during this time period can be more accurately labeled as bioracism. This means that thinkers were providing scientific legitimation to racism, which was already held. This is tying racial prejudice to inborn and unchanging traits of biology or blood purity. In the United States, bioracism became the most in vogue and dominant science of the day. Bioracism in America was nothing short of ubiquitous, from popular culture to politics and even daily life. American bioracism began by defining who counted in the white race. A number of purportedly scientific theories are put forth during this time period, labeling Americans first as Germanic, Teutons, and Caucasians, then Anglo-Saxons. The proof for this racial heritage was derived through craniological studies, which argued that people from the Caucasus Mountains had the most beautiful skulls in the world, and therefore, white people must all be derived from the Caucasus region because white people are the best looking people in the world. This, at the time, was not a joke, but was actually science coming out of Harvard. Bioracists were still posed with a problem in explaining American greatness. They came up with the theory of racial distillation, whereby a race which is provided with optimal environmental conditions can actually evolve. Early American Anglo-Saxon theories claim that this is what happened as Anglo-Saxons moved to the harsh wilderness of the United States and were therefore transformed through labor and discovery into a higher order of white people known as Americans. This theory can also be combined with the Aryan myth, which utilizes philology and bioracism and became an international phenomenon at the time. This myth claimed that there was an ancient advanced group of people from Tibet who spread outwards into India and conquered the less advanced Dravidian people and started a major renaissance of human civilization and religion. This group also spread northwest to found ancient Greece, Egypt, and Rome, finally ending up in Germany, England, and the United States. The Aryan people therefore became responsible for all human development and every major civilization in ancient history. The Aryans were placed at the heart of every major advancement in human history and scientifically, quote unquote, proven to be the most superior peoples in human history. In American culture more broadly, we can see evidence of eugenics everywhere. The American Birth Control League was co-founded by Margaret Sanger and Lothrop Stoddard, who was a Klan member and writer of The Rising Tide of Color Against the White World Supremacy. This book was so popular that Tom Buchanan claims to be reading it in The Great Gatsby. And in 1922, President Warren G. Harding recommended that all Americans should read it. Margaret Sanger actually created Planned Parenthood as a eugenics movement during this time to prevent degenerate people from breeding. Sanger popularized Planned Parenthood by going on speaking engagements at Ku Klux Klan rallies. We can also include the international bestseller, The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant, for which the New York Times wrote a full 2-page glowing review. The idea of superior racial birth and the dangers of negative birth were everywhere, when leading to overriding fears of a eugenic apocalypse which might destroy the race. It is this eugenic apocalypse which thinkers at this time said must be guarded against. And it's also this type of thinking that led to the ending of immigration to the United States in 1924. America takes its biggest turn in bioracism with the introduction of negative eugenics and degenerate studies. Positive eugenics was popular prior to 1899 and involved the promotion of birth amongst people with traits viewed as favorable. However, in the United States, they developed the idea of degenerate studies. Degenerate studies attempted to pinpoint the reasons for individuals ending up in prison or insane asylums, etc. These bioracists claimed that the majority of prison inmates were actually related to each other and could therefore be tied to singular patriarchs and matriarchs. This means that degeneracy is passed down biologically. To clearly make this point, bioracists such as Richard Dugdale claimed that all societal problems, including alcoholism, pauperism, vagrancy, etc., could be traced to singular women, meaning the original sin for all of these families was, quote, female harlotry, end quote. These degenerate families, who were costing the state millions in aid and taking up most of the prison cells, could be traced to these individual women, such as Deborah Collicock or Margaret Juke. Both of those are pseudonyms. Perhaps the most telling example comes from Deborah Collicock herself, as the name Collicock in Greek literally translates as evil beauty. We can see through this the way that scientists viewed these young women. All negative human traits could be tied to these women of supposedly loose morals, and through degeneracy studies, it was theoretically proven that these women wrought immense harm on society for generations through their bad decisions. It is through degenerate family studies that we come to the next contribution of America to bioracism, which is negative eugenics. Unlike positive eugenics, which suggests promoting birth amongst people with positive traits, negative eugenics asserts that those with bad, quote unquote, bad traits should be cut off from the gene pool so as not to cause further harm. This thinking was not limited to the world of academics of science, but instead played out with real life consequences. Carrie Buck, who was a young woman in Virginia who lived with her mother at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded, was 17 years old when she became pregnant as a result of rape. Following the birth of her daughter in 1924, her child was taken into state custody and Buck was forcibly sterilized. Her case made it to the Supreme Court, and in 1927, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the Buck v. Bell sterilization decision, quote, for the protection of the state, end quote. In his famous decision, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes claimed forced sterilization would usher in a new era for American eugenics, and claimed, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, end quote. Over the next decade, over 30 US states would enact forced sterilization laws. By 1968, over 65,000 American women had been forcibly sterilized. In fact, when creating the Nuremberg laws, the Nazis specifically cited the Buck v. Bell case and Virginia eugenics laws to write their own. Virginia repealed the eugenics law in 1974. It's 1974. In our pictures, we see a headline from a popular Science Monthly about registering human pedigrees with the Eugenics Record Office. This article is written by US Senator Arthur Copper. Above, we have a certificate from the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor Lab in New York, which proved your genetic qualifications before marriage in order to, quote, promote the happiness and future welfare of the race, end quote. And finally, an Eastern European immigrant is pictured here having his nose measured to determine eligibility into the United States. Craniology and other bioracist measures were used prior to cutting off immigration in 1924. Here we see a eugenics demonstration on Wall Street in New York City in 1913. As you can see, common messages of degenerate studies and bioracism are pictured here, such as the sign which reads, "Would the prisons and asylums be filled if my kind had no children?" Alcoholism, illiteracy, and all forms of social ill were traced to inferior breeding, and eugenics promoted a scientific solution to stop the perpetual downward slide of humanity. Bioracism was ubiquitous in American culture, from advertisements to entertainment and science. We now turn specifically to Buddhism in America. Buddhism already had a presence in America dating back to the 1850s with Chinese immigrants. However, Chinese Americans in California did not have the same institutional staying power, in part due to the driven out years of the 1880s, when over 165 separate communities along America's West Coast literally rounded up Chinese immigrants and drove them from town, often putting them onto trains and shipping them via cattle car to larger cities or Mexico or Canada. Japanese Buddhists begin to arrive in earnest around the turn of the 20th century in a period of intense anti-Asian racism known as the Yellow Peril. The Yellow Peril argued that Asians were of a particularly lower race as proven by bioracism. However, the population of countries in Asia, such as China, who were racially predisposed to slavery, and Japan, who were racially predisposed to cunning and manipulative thinking, could be combined to overtake the Western world. According to supposed scientists, Japan and China may use this growing population to create a eugenic apocalypse. This theoretically scientific hypothesis would then be repeated in popular culture. Jack London wrote The Unparalleled Invasion in 1910, which described the teaming of Japan and China to create a race of super soldiers, who then invade the United States and make the United States into Chinese property by 1970. Asians were represented as a population out of control due to racial sexual insatiability. We return now to the Aryans and the contribution of Buddhist studies. Buddhist studies in many ways began with philology. This has been studied by Charles Hallisey, Donald Lopez, and others, as early Buddhist studies scholars viewed lived Buddhism as lesser and therefore focused only on texts. The study of Sanskrit and Pali led to a discovery about the Aryans in language families. philologists noticed similarities between Indo-Aryan or Indo-European languages and posited that an Aryan language must have existed. This means that a connection could be made linguistically between the Aryans of India and Greeks, Romans, and Europeans. In other words, concrete science was provided to the Aryan myth. In Buddhist studies, this led to a revolution of publishing in the Polytext Society, Eugene Burnouf, and others. However, in translating Buddhist texts, scholars also came across the Buddhist use of the term Aryan. In Buddhism, Aryan is used as Sanskrit, meaning noble. The Buddha is a noble person. The Four Noble Truths are actually the four truths for Aryans, or the four truths for noble people. However, for scholars of this time in an era of bioracism, this meant that the Buddha was racially Aryan. How could this be? According to Buddhist studies scholars, the Buddha was racially Aryan, which is why he was able to create such a superior religious tradition. But then he spreads that tradition amongst racially inferior people, and the tradition was thus corrupted. Buddhism had undergone such intense devolution that the current religion was unrecognizable. It was only through Western scholarly translations that Asian Buddhists could hope to be retaught the correct version of Buddhism. This devolution continued as Buddhism spread, as the doctrines of Mahayana and Vajrayana were viewed as even worse by comparison. When discussing Pure Land Buddhism in Japan, Eugene Burnouf famously wrote that the doctrines are, quote, so odious the pen can barely write of them, end quote. So the Buddha was racially Aryan, but Buddhism was a corrupted Asian tradition. This is the thinking of Buddhist studies at the time. Even the burgeoning field of psychology was involved. Carl Jung declared that in the storehouse consciousness, Aryans represented the center of the universe. Jung claimed that the Eastern mind was characterized as spiritual, effeminate, and sedated, while the Western mind was scientific, masculine, and active. Buddhist studies scholars blamed a number of groups for ruining the once great Aryan tradition of Buddhism. The blame for this corruption, or degenerate Buddhist studies, we might say, follows groups who gained particular ire in the time period. Tibetans, for instance, were blamed for adding witchcraft and cannibalism to Buddhism. Remember that Tibet is the home of the Aryans, meaning they would be particularly responsible. However, scholars also focused on the clericalism of Tibetan Buddhism, referring to the Dalai Lama as the Buddhist Pope. This suggests that anti-Catholic sentiments were also placed into this argument. The Aryan race in bioracism is synonymous with freedom, while other races were predisposed to slavery, usually perpetuated through clerical dominance, such as a pope or Dalai Lama. Hinduization was also blamed for the corruption of Buddhism. Hindu Indians became the other to the superior Aryan Buddhists. According to these scholars writing during Indian colonization, it was the idol worship and greed of the Brahmins which infected Buddhism and corrupted the tradition. The Hinduization hypothesis was meant to be a warning, whereby even the most superior tradition could be brought down with long-term contact next to an inferior group. Buddhist studies directly influenced American popular culture. American newspapers cited the devolution theories of a corrupted Buddhism with an Aryan at its heart, damaged by the racially inferior Asians in newspapers across the United States, as well as nonfiction stories about Buddhism and Asian peoples. We can clearly see the machinations in changing ideology by tracing the position of China versus Japan in American news reporting. Interestingly, despite Japanese war hysteria in 1907, many American news sources present China as the true danger to America in the early 1900s, whereas by the 1930s, the Japanese are presented as the existential threat, while China is viewed as a potential ally. This is especially following the conversion of Chiang Kai-shek to Christianity and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. By the 1930s, it was not just a particular country which was corrupt, but Buddhism itself. National newspapers and magazines like Harper's and The Atlantic described Buddhism as corrupt and undemocratic, saying that the religion could not fit with the democratic society, and that Buddhist monks in Japan regularly practiced animal cruelty, debauchery, and even trafficked in prostitution. For one example of Buddhism in American culture, I have here a picture of Captain America, issue number 35 from February 1944, which features a monstrous Buddha of Kamakura hypnotizing devotees into a mindless horde. Other sources present Buddhism as atheistic and nihilistic. It's, quote, the religion of annihilation, which dupes Asians who are incapable of higher thought into believing that death is the ultimate goal of life. Other national news declared that Buddhism in the United States would be the end of American Christianity, as Asian hordes would propagate their foreign creed across the country. This was the danger to be had. Buddhist studies in America was produced as a warning. Lesser people could corrupt even great traditions, and even an Aryan philosophy of rationalism and science could be devolved into a religion of idolatry and demon worship. However, the tradition could be revived if only superior people might teach civilization and history of Aryan greatness back to Asians. We can see here Buddhist studies justifying and buttressing colonialism and colonial understandings. This cartoon comes from Puck magazine in 1900, meaning it was likely in reference to the Philippines, but it's a nice representation of how Americans at this time viewed their colonialism. As you can see, Uncle Sam leads the troops home with one hand and at the same time ushers in a small army of school marms with books on civilization and history. The American brand of imperialism was viewed as bringing education and civilization. The other thing to note in this vein is that in American colonial art, the indigenous people actually look happy, which is different. In a lot of British colonial art, the colonial peoples look shocked or dirty, this sort of thing. In American ideology, every nation is always happy to see America. So that's a definite difference there. So Buddhists were dealing with immense pressures through racecraft, immigration, and even academic and scientific studies. How they reacted to these pressures was largely determined by their relation to colonialism and racecraft. With the rise of colonialism in Asia, Buddhists began to create a global network through travel, publishing, and institutional connection. The Theosophical Society famously funded a great deal of travel for Anagarika Dharmapala and others, while Japanese Buddhists regularly traveled to India and Sri Lanka to study Theravada Buddhism, as detailed by Richard Jaffe. For our first image, I have an article from a Washington State newspaper, the Sunday Puget Sound American, from 1906, which claims that there's a rival yellow peril, also known as the dusky peril, which comes down from Canada. In Sri Lanka, which was directly colonized by the British, Anagarika Dharmapala, lay Buddhist propagator, started the Mahabodhi and the United Buddhist World magazine. This magazine was named after the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya, India, where the Buddha reached enlightenment. At this time, it was not a Buddhist temple, but a shrine to Shiva, and he started this magazine expressly to set Mahabodhi as a Buddhist Mecca and unify the Buddhist world by taking the site back. Throughout his career, Dharmapala used science and Buddhist doctrine to argue that Asians were in fact the true Aryans, and that the British were in fact the lower race. This was because of the racial superiority of Buddha over that of the Semitic Jesus of Nazareth. Dharmapala directly engages anti-Semitic rhetoric when he claims, quote, It is this religion fit for the ape man that European Christians want that Buddhists should accept, and annually millions of money are being spent to preach this tribal religion of a wild Semitic tribe to the Aryan people of Ceylon, end quote. Dharmapala uses the most cutting-edge science of the day to claim that Buddhism is not a corrupted tradition, it is the superior tradition, and therefore Sri Lankans are the superior people. Colonialism is therefore described by Dharmapala as, quote, primeval forest cut down with ruthless destructiveness. Aesthetic beauty had no attraction to the Vandals who went to exploit distant countries. And this destruction could be explained scientifically as the spirit of destructiveness is ingrained in the Western mind, being the result of their having imbibed the spirit of Yahwehism of the Old Testament of the Jews of Canaan. The unmoral civilization of the Semitic tribes of Palestine became the only panacea for all ills of the European before the dawn of science, end quote. Again, in 1920, Aryanism was science, and Buddhism was considered an Aryan religion. This was considered scientific fact. Dharmapala reverses colonial tropes by casting a spell of racecraft, which uses Buddhism, along with the burgeoning field of bioracism, to promote Aryan Buddhist superiority and argue that the Western form of civilization is unwanted in Asia. For Dharmapala, the truth is symbolized in this 1899 drawing by William Walker, which was featured in Life magazine. It's called The White Man's Burden with a question mark and was published in 1899. It shows that the true burden falls on the marginalized rather than the supposedly superior racially American or British. Prior to World War II, America spread bioracism across the globe. Japan, especially following the Meiji Restoration and development of Shinbokyo, or New Buddhism, was in a particular position to bring in ideas of science, race, and religion to modernize. Japanese Buddhists were particularly ready for the developments of race sciences, as they had just gone through a period of persecution during the Meiji era. Anti-Buddhist rhetoric from the government forced Buddhists to create defensive tropes about Japaneseness, such as Nihon Jinran, and Japanese connections to the emperor. But they had also utilized the Ekayana doctrine. The doctrine of Ekayana comes from the Tendai school and was used to say that the Buddha himself provided a dumbed-down version of Buddhism in South Asia because the people there could not handle it. He then taught a second version of Buddhism in China before teaching a full and complete rendition of Buddhism to the Japanese, who had the mental capacity to truly appreciate it. This doctrinal justification buttressed the new and burgeoning science entering Japan in the form of eugenics, or Jinshu Kaizengaku, the science of race betterment. This idea was spread a lot through Yusei Undo, which was the popular science magazine of the time. Bioracism became a dominant fad in Japan throughout the 1920s and 1930s. On the right side of the slide, we can see a comparison from Yusei Undo between the public servant Chinese, as it's stated, against the Japanese warrior. And so this magazine continues the idea of the Chinese as slavish versus the Japanese warrior samurai history. The Japanese therefore became the Yamato race, which was defined as one and the same with the Aryan people. Japanese bioracists claimed that the Aryans moved east to Japan, where they held on to their race of blood purity on a distant island, rather than the Aryans spreading west to Greece and becoming Europeans. This theory was pushed throughout the Buddhist world, as Arnagrika Dharmapala wrote, quote, "With the introduction of Buddhism, Japan became Aryanized," end quote. Buddhism was the Aryanizing force which could propel races further into human evolution. The Japanese, as the most distilled Aryans, combined with Yamato purity, could therefore spread Buddhism back across Asia for Asian people. In the 1930s Showa era, Imperial Japan was colonizing Korea, Manchuria, Indonesia, and beyond. In English language Buddhist periodicals in Japan, as well as Canada and the United States, Buddhist magazines wrote that India and China never actually had a religion, because without Buddhism, which was the one true Aryan religion, they never actually had any sort of religion. And so therefore the Japanese could teach them true religion. Without the superior Buddhism, which was actually the basis for all human historical development, there would be no philosophy or science, which was tied to the Aryan race of the Buddha, who proposed a rational and scientific religion. So it is only Japan which can bring civilization to Asia. The West, it was said, was materialistic. This could be cited in psychological science. So they would only bring a false civilization of disease and hypocrisy. Japanese Buddhist magazines regularly ran clan lynching statistics to prove how backwards and racist America actually was. The East, alternatively, was spiritual, with Buddhism as its Aryan fount and the Yamato race as its defenders. Buddhists did not cheer violence, but they provided religious justification to the Japanese colonial project. Buddhism was presented as Aryan and therefore racially superior. It was proven by Western thinkers to be one and the same with science. Japanese Buddhist intellectuals took these tropes, combined with Ekayana and Nihon Jinran, to explain that the Japanese were in fact the superior Aryans, who had already had the most advanced and perfected form of human spirituality, which was also science and philosophy simultaneously. Similarly, in bioracism, it was claimed that Semitic tribes were materialistic due to their racial nature, and therefore lacked true religion. In the Eastern Buddhist, D.T. Suzuki claimed that civilization could not come from materialistic people, and the West was materialistic because it had no religion. The West was only based on Semitic blood sacrifice, which was, quote, revolting, the symbol of cruelty or of inhumanity. The idea of washing sin with blood of Christ crucified reminds us of the primitive barbarism of victim offering to the gods, end quote. Only Buddhism could spread peace, philosophy, and science throughout the world with the Japanese Imperial Army as its troops. In our second picture, we have a propaganda pamphlet delivered in Manchuria warning Chinese citizens about joining the communist KMT. You will note the Chinese are very dark-skinned and engage in acts of barbarity, while their sack of money and puppet strings are controlled by the white race. The white race, in fact, is just the devil in disguise. Meanwhile, the light-skinned and rosy-cheeked Japanese army rides in on clouds to save the Chinese people. Ideologies of racecraft are dangerous for everyone and contribute to real-world violence. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, ordering all persons of Japanese descent to report to internment camps. It should be noted that this was planned far in advance of Pearl Harbor. First-generation Japanese immigrants were labeled ineligible for citizenship, and the US military had suggested interning Japanese immigrants as far back as 1936, 5 years prior to Pearl Harbor. It was also not the first time Asian Americans had been rounded up and put on trains on the West Coast. During World War II, the entire West Coast of the United States was designated part of the Pacific Theater, or battle zone. And the US Army Plan for Defense declared that basically any persons residing there could be legally interned. Here, we have real-life examples of the Yellow Peril in America. We can see images of anti-Japanese protests in California featuring young children, as well as signage declaring where Asian Americans were not allowed. These signs could be found in many towns throughout California and sometimes included statements like, "Don't let the sun set on you here." Many Buddhist publications ceased being put out from 1939 to about 1944 during World War II. However, throughout Jodo Shinshu temples in particular, or Buddhist churches, along the West Coast, youth groups published Busei magazines. The Berkeley Busei of the Berkeley Buddhist Church provides a picture of Japanese American Buddhist life for young people. Here, we of course find discussions of more mundane matters, like finding girlfriends and boyfriends or sports leagues, but we also have the publications of doctrinal writings. Liberal and modernist understandings of Shin doctrine are discussed here. Japanese American teens say that Amida may not be a real being at all, but a state of human perfection when the self has dissolved. This means young Japanese Buddhists in the Shin lineage, which was once labeled as the ethnic fortress, were actually publishing and promoting modernist interpretations of Buddhism bordering on the secular, while American Buddhists were overlaying the particularly ethnic forms of racecraft and metaphysical religion onto American Buddhism. In other words, I think this research should help complicate and nuance some of our thinkings and promote the questioning of what is meant by terms like science and modernity in comparison to Buddhism. But we should also question whose Buddhism is ethnic versus secular or modern. Jodo Shinshu young people were reading stories about Amida as a state of mind, while Western Buddhists were still reading about cyclopses, Buddhist connections to Egypt, and other fantastical ideas. The writings of Buddhists leading up to World War II utilized racecraft to promote the doctrines of Buddhism as scientific for American audiences. This argument helped Buddhism to become popularized in America in the 1950s and beyond. The top pictures in this slide show a young girl holding her doll before being boarded onto a cattle car bound for an internment camp, while the second photo shows Japanese Americans behind barbed wire next to an incoming train. We turn now to our final group, which I call Metaphysical Buddhists. In some of the primary sources from these groups, like the Golden Lotus, these groups refer to themselves as white Buddhists, meaning pure, although colloquially we might associate these with being white people as well. So, we are talking metaphysical Buddhists, by which I mean those who liberally mix Buddhism with metaphysical religions in America, as defined by Catherine Albanese. These entities would have been easily confused in America during this time period. Theosophy claimed to be true Buddhism, the Aryan tradition. Similarly, Buddhist magazines across the world promoted theosophy and the writings of Helena Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. Buddhist magazines published in America, like the Golden Lotus, started out as theosophically Buddhist-inclined magazines and only later denounced theosophy in lieu of more traditional Buddhism. However, they continue to print stories on Buddhism in ancient Egypt and the like. Japanese Buddhist magazines also feature monthly works from theosophists, such as D.T. Suzuki and the Eastern Buddhist. Suzuki and his wife, Beatrice Lane, actually started the first two theosophical lodges in Japan. So there's a lot of connection between these two groups. If theosophists in the 1910s and 1920s are claiming to be true Buddhists in America, and Buddhists are claiming that theosophy is close to their own doctrines in the 1930s and 1940s, it makes sense to look at the racial ramifications of theosophical Buddhism. The doctrines of theosophy claim to be science. They begin with the Aryan root race in Tibet, just like science of this day. However, according to theosophical evolution, humanity progresses through root races. Each race evolves spiritually before obtaining a high enough level of enlightenment where their souls begin a new root race, taking place multiple times over multiple planets. This human evolution on Earth is the Aryan root race, our current root race. The spiritual masters of the Aryan race form a single world government known as the Great White Brotherhood. They are located in Tibet in the Great White Mountains. You're piecing together the theosophical doctrines here. Anyway, the previous evolution of humanity was on Atlantis. The Atlanteans were conquered by the Aryans, who were more spiritually evolved. But some Atlanteans escaped and hid in Asia and Africa, where, quote, some of the accursed races, separating from the main stock, now lived in the jungles and underground when the golden yellow race became in its turn black with sin, end quote. Theosophy posits that karma is a physical substance which sticks to a soul or monad and causes the skin to darken as a representation of inward sin. Therefore, by removing sin, a person will become whiter with each successive rebirth. In Theosophy, the evolution of humanity was tied to the progress of races. This was viewed as an upward trajectory towards higher forms of evolution. The singular monad or soul would evolve upwards and reach higher spiritual milestones until ultimately reaching the oversoul. In The Golden Lotus, a popular Buddhist magazine beginning in 1944, there is a running editorial to explain Buddhist doctrine, and it's called The Aryan Path. It describes the Buddha as the wisest man of our race. In tracing this editorial, we see a full reprint of The White Man's Burden in one instance, which says, quote, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, to serve your captive need, your new caught sullen peoples, half devils and half child. So here we see the way Buddhism and Asian Buddhists were being described in metaphysical Buddhist magazines from America at this time. A telling of the story of the Chela is also included in the Aryan path. A Chela is a Buddhist novice, but in this story, he progresses along the Buddhist path and reaches states of jhana meditation that also involve cyclopses, ice monsters, and other elements of theosophical lore. The Chela finally reaches, quote, the ultimate Aryan enlightenment and is then able to dethrone the god of tyrannical dogmas and arbitrary commands, end quote. The Aryan path ties these tyrannical doctrines to Lamaism and the corruption of Asian Buddhism. Interestingly, throughout these publications, we find a continual focus on the Buddhist notion of the self, the Anatman or no self doctrine. Metaphysical Buddhists quote Buddhist studies scholars to argue that the doctrine of no self was the Asian corruption of Buddhism, and that Buddhism should, in fact, have a self. It was the various monks of Asia who corrupted Buddhism by adding no self and confusing the lesser Asian race into a petrified stupor. By adding a soul to Buddhism, the religion more easily aligned with theosophical doctrine as well as American values. By 1929, Manly P. Hall, founder of the Philosophical Research Center, wrote, quote, to Buddha, there was nothing real but the self, nothing absolute but the self, no true attainment but perfect unification with the self, end quote. It similarly disparaged Asian Buddhism and explained the corruption of the Aryan tradition. In other Buddhist sources of the 1940s and 1950s, America is actually proclaimed to be a future Buddhist utopia. We find this for instance, in The Secret Destiny of America. This book by Manly P. Hall claims that Christopher Columbus was a hero of the Aryan race, and that there was once a Buddhist university in Atlantis. This Buddhist university was the shape of a pyramid with a large observatory at the top. This racial alma mater of all Buddhists is featured on the American $1 bill. Buddhists did it before the Illuminati, in other words. In either case, America was declared as the future home of Buddhist utopia. This notion was backed up by science, which claimed Americans to be the most distilled form of the Aryan race, and Buddhism to be the Aryan religious doctrine. Buddhists all over the world agreed that Buddhism was Buddhists all over the world agreed that Buddhism was the Aryan tradition at the heart of all spiritual development. It is clear in metaphysical Buddhist writings, from The Secret Destiny of America to The Golden Lotus, that only those who have achieved a high enough status of spiritual evolutionary progress will make this Buddhist utopia a reality. It is only when humanity has progressed spiritually enough that the Buddhist utopia will come into fruition. So, the question is, who then is holding back the Buddhist utopia? Well, according to metaphysical Buddhists in the 1940s, it's Asian Buddhists, of course. It was they who corrupted the Aryan tradition, they who withheld Americans' true genealogical birthright. In this sense, Asian Buddhists are holding back all of human progress. Spiritual enlightenment is being held up. However, as a 1944 Buddhist publication makes clear, it was the other races of, quote, Africa and the East, as far as India, including Ceylon, who were of low-grade karmic intelligence, materialistic, selfish, cruel, revengeful, and at their height, they developed a great deal of sorcery and black magic, which corrupted Buddhism, end quote. Meanwhile, the religion could be saved, and a new utopia could be ushered in if only American Buddhists reclaimed their rightful genealogical gift in the form of Buddhism. Buddhism was thus thoroughly Aryanized by the 1950s. In fact, in 1957, 12 years after World War II and after the UN resolution against scientific racism, Buddhist publications like Zen Notes continue to describe the Aryan race in Buddhism and promotes the Buddha as racially Aryan. Again, I'll quote Manly P. Hall, who describes Buddhism who describes Buddhism in the West as, quote, "We are fundamentally a materialistic people, and few are the Occidentals who are not in some measure bound by material values, attachments, and ambitions. Metaphysics is to us an avocation, a hobby, a luxury, a passing experience. We must accept the materiality of our race as part of the divine plan. Like the prodigal son, we must metaphorically go down into Egypt and herd swine. In the end, we shall be richer for all the experiences that we shall have gained. We shall be wiser and nobler for our journey in the land of darkness and error. The reward for our experience is to be truly greater than the angels in acquiring wisdom, courage, vision, and truth. Because we are very different from Easterners, and because we are different from the ancients, we must adapt their mystical philosophies to our present conditions," end quote. So when I present my research, I'm often asked the question, which I present here, which is Buddhism in America still Aryan? Now, for this slide, I obviously chose baiting images for that. I literally Googled white people meditating to find these pictures. So I was looking for it. However, the question still remains. If anyone's wondering, that's Brad Pitt. It's in the movie 7 Years in Tibet. So Brad Pitt is not a Buddhist, but interestingly, he is right there playing a man who was a member of the Nazi Party of Germany. So there's still a connection either way. What does this mean for Buddhism in America today? And what does it mean for Buddhist studies? In studies of Buddhism, we have the theory of parallel congregations combined with 2 Buddhisms or 3 Buddhisms, which all basically mean that Asian American Buddhists do not tend to go to the same services and groups as white Buddhists, even when they do go to the same temples. My research shows the foundation of these later developments. Buddhism was largely segregated during this time period and is only now re-emerging. So we see these sorts of racial tensions in my time period. However, scholars like Jan Nattier, who came up with the term three Buddhisms, which splits export, import, and baggage Buddhists, have taken a great deal of flack for their taxonomies, and at worst have been accused of racism in some of these taxonomies. I don't think this is the case. I actually think that scholars of the 1990s were trying to describe what they saw, which was racecraft and racism. But in the 90s, they were trying to find something else to call it. And so they came up with other names for race and race creation, racecraft, when really they were just circling the truth of what we find in American Buddhism. We can also question the Zen boom. Many scholars have posited the Zen boom as Zen arriving in America like a bomb in the 1950s. But my research proves that it was through continued doctrinal adaptations and publishing that Buddhists were able to spread Zen popularity. During this time, Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki became famous, with Suzuki even appearing on the cover of Vogue magazine. But the Zen boom was not a sudden explosion of American interest or Buddhist presence, but the result of Asian resistance to dominant colonial tropes, combined with the assertion of racial supremacy that popularized Buddhism in America. The supposed Zen boom was building ideology and the acceptance of Buddhism in America as scientific and Aryan tradition. More recently, we have the idea of postmodern Buddhism and Buddhist modernism. In American Dharma, Dr. Ann Gleig argues that in many cases of American Buddhism, practitioners have in some ways gone beyond the Buddhist modernist label proposed by David McMahon and are instead Buddhist postmodernists. Dr. Gleig argues that postmodernism is defined by a questioning and contradicting of the grand narratives of modernization. I think we can see that as Buddhists have generally cast aside bio-racism and Aryanism as a means of explaining Buddhism, however, we can still see the presence of these ideas today. Similarly, Dr. Gleig asserts that white privilege has become a defining feature of American Buddhism in its current form. I would therefore add to Dr. Gleig's work on modern Buddhism that this white privilege can be traced to an Aryanizing of Buddhism which contributed to its very modernization. In other words, to be modern at this time was to use racecraft and Aryanize the Dharma. So the very modernisms which Buddhists are drawing on today have racecraft baked directly into them. I believe that my work helps to nuance and historically support Dr. Gleig's current findings about American Buddhism today. For instance, Dr. Gleig says that one distinctively postmodern feature of American Buddhism is the valorization of traditional Buddhism combined with a simultaneous decontextualization of doctrines and the desire for modernity. But we can see examples of this thinking in my time period as well, as Buddhists assumed the Buddha was racially superior Aryan, while modern America would become the future Buddhist heartland. My research provides historical roots for the modern phenomenon being described by Dr. Ann Gleig as part of Buddhism in America. These two studies prove the continuing influence of racecraft. In many ways, American bioracism as modern science was combined with Buddhist doctrines in an age of colonialism to create what David McMahon called global folk Buddhism. We can also see these types of like Aryanizing Buddhism play out in real life. We see it in Burma and the Rohingya genocide. Ashwin Viratu and the 969 movement often uses the language of Buddhist Aryanism and the idea of protecting the Dharma against pollution in his writings. In Sri Lanka and Thailand, you also have ongoing issues with those of other religions, and the language of Buddhists as Aryanism permeates these discussions. However, In America, particularly, this discussion is slightly different because, as always, it is directly tied to race. Uh, in my own research, I have found Aryanism cropping up on the internet in the world of the alt-right. In the book Atlas and Prometheus, published in 2016, Jason Reza Georgiani claims that Buddhism is the future religion of the white race. At the top of the slide today, we have a picture of Eric, who is a self-avowed Nazi Buddhist, who is also a leader in the alt-right. And below, we have a Reddit forum that I came across called Alt Buddhism, with the motto, "Unite the Right of Dharma." You'll also notice the black sun, which is a Nazi symbol used after the war. In their description, Alt Buddhism claims, quote, "Western Buddhism is castrated, weak, corrupted, and corrupted by progressivism and rejects the original, thoroughly masculine, head-oriented ascetic system advocated by the warrior aristocrat Siddhartha Gautama. Alt Buddhism offers an alternative to standard Western Buddhism for those with wisdom and strength to make strong people stronger. This is a place for promoting fearlessness, self-discipline, and austerity, with the acknowledgement that all suffering is self-inflicted. Victimhood is for the weak," end quote. On their Reddit, they recommend books by numerous mystical Hitler philosophers and others such as Julius Evola, who writes on the Aryanness of the Buddhist doctrine. So in other words, Aryan Buddhism and the Aryanization of Buddhism certainly has not disappeared and has not gone away entirely in the world today. I end today with a couple of parallel pictures. These images present a sort of depiction of the yellow peril in America. The first image is from The Wasp, a magazine mostly published on the West Coast, depicting a new Statue of Liberty for California, which features a ruin to white labor, disease, immorality, and filth around its crown. And this can be compared with popular depictions of Asian Americans, such as Fu Manchu, the evil Asian mad scientist, played here by British actor Boris Karloff, and both seem to be doing the teaching mudra of the Buddha here. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Ryan, for this really tremendous presentation. If people want to use the raise hand feature, that'll allow Ryan to see who's asking questions. If you click on the participants icon, then you'll see a menu on the sidebar where you can raise your hand. And if you're watching on Facebook, if you type a question or comment into the chat, hopefully Allison will be able to drop those into the Zoom chat. So the floor is open. Well, maybe while people are thinking of questions, and also there is a short delay in the Facebook stream of about 20 seconds, I think, typically. Uh, I just was really struck by the sort of interplay between science and religion in these particular movements, where the modernist discourse of science, in particular race science in this case, but it's a discourse of science that you were very insistent on, that it is a sort of science built on all of these kind of cranial studies and this kind of thing.
Right.
How much that overlapped with ideas about spirituality. And we tend to think of science and secularism as going hand in hand, and religion being, something different and hostile, to science. And I wondered if, that was what was at play in some sense, with the Japanese being able to appropriate discourses of racial science, Aryan origins, and so on, and whether that's also something similar that you see in American religion at the time, in the case of, for example, African American religions that are also looking to non Christian alternatives like the Moorish Science Temple. And so, anyway, just those intersections were interesting. I wonder if you could comment further on the effect of this intersection between religion and science.
Absolutely, yeah. So it is interesting because it's sort of based in the colonial time period, which we find Buddhists in. So a lot of the times leading up to the turn of the 20th century, Buddhists themselves were being critiqued as anti-scientific or as backwards and this sort of thing. So in trying to prove themselves scientific, they also were able to use this doctrine of the Aryan myth, which was present in Buddhism. So it provided this bridge between their own spirituality and science at a time when they were being blamed as sort of lesser Buddhists or non-scientific, this sort of thing. So this Aryan myth and the presence of Aryan in Buddhism allowed that bridge between spirituality and allowed them to make sort of counter arguments to colonialism or to the idea that they were atheistic as Buddhists or didn't have a religion because they were Buddhists. So it absolutely allowed them to sort of make this bridge between the two, the science and spirituality. And we do see this again in the history of other American religious traditions. I'm thinking of, like, the Mormons, for instance, use race to define spirituality quite a lot. And then in the Moorish Science Temple, Nation of Islam, again, you have a sort of reappropriating of racial scientific discussions to further a different aim, to further the aim of you're not superior, we are superior. You don't have religion, we have religion. It's a way of reversing those colonial tropes or racist tropes, but that religion, and especially Buddhism, because it had this sort of Aryanism idea in it, allowed it, or contributed to that bridge very nicely, right? Like, it was sort of building on ideologies that were already there, as well as incoming ideologies of colonialism, science, and like new religious traditions at the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Fascinating. Looks like somebody who was referred to in the talk, I believe, Dr. Ann Gleig has her.
I'm just staring at Dr. Ann Gleig's screen now. Thank you very much for showing up, Dr. Gleig. It's a pleasure.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just wanted to say thank you, Ryan, for the talk. It was really fantastic and I learned a lot. And I wanted to say that I definitely do think that you've brought a lot of nuance. It was really helpful for me because in my work, I kind of talk about this slippage between modernity and whiteness, but I don't really have the actual details, you know. I just kind of talk more generally about whiteness and modernity. Right. So it was like, it was really wonderful to get that, you know, real like richness of detail. So I was like smiling my face off.
Oh, good.
It was, yeah, I mean, I thought it was like excellent, and I'm so excited about your book. I can't wait to use it and teach with it. Just, I think, really important research, and I love the way that you connected it to the present moment, you know, of alt-right Buddhists. My question is, Brenda and I think Brenda has a name but not her face. Well, Brandner and I are working on a range of backlashes to racial justice work in American convert Buddhism. And so the backlash we found really covers a wide spectrum, from what we're calling reactionary centrists to like the alt-right figures, you know, that you showed at the end.
Right.
And one trope that we've really found is, you know, cultural, this like, you know, the seeing of any diversity, inclusion, and equity work as like the invasion of Marxism in Buddhism. So I was curious if, you know, the question's a bit, you know, a bit left field, so I apologize for that. But I was curious if you'd come across any encounters, you know, with Marxists, you know, as part of this larger story of you know, the Aryanized Buddhist lineages that you trace, and especially thinking about how, you know, it shows up more in like centrist figures that we wouldn't immediately, you know, see as so extreme like today. Like the alt-rights are obviously like, you know, so visibly extreme, but we're more concerned how it shows up in more like mainstream, you know, white converts. So just kind of wanted to pick your brains on that if you had any thoughts.
Right. Yeah, that is very interesting. So I have come across some discussion of Marx throughout these Buddhist magazines and things. It wasn't something that I was particularly focused on at the time, but especially like, so D.T. Suzuki, as you know, just wrote and wrote and wrote about kind of everything. And so he deals with Marxism and Marxist thought a bit. My recollection is that he's actually like somewhat favorable to it. Like it's not totally a shutdown like you might imagine during this time period, but I don't have a lot of like particular groups and how they dealt with that. It seemed to be like communism was still viewed, or Marxism and communism was still very much viewed in the same sort of specter of Bolshevism idea throughout a lot of this.
Right, so it wasn't seen as like a particular threat to Aryan Buddhism in any way?
Not that I found, no.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for the wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, it would be very interesting as well to sort of parse out for like Buddhists that you study today. Do they know about this Aryan history? Do they draw on it? Do they have any knowledge? No.
They don't know, but I think they're super interested because when I shared the poster for your talk on my social media, there was like a lot of interest, and I've got a lot of like, you know, followers. So I think that, you know, think if you could get maybe, you know, actually I'll email you, maybe I can hook you up with Tricycle or Lions Roar to reach a larger audience. I think that could be really great to get your work out.
Cool. Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, and you can also, we'll have other talks in the future. You can let them know about the School of Religions, exciting roster of events. Any other questions? I don't see any other hands up. Okay, I think Shobana, you had a question.
Yes. Hi, Ryan. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
It's nice to hear you talk. I had an initial question, which kind of Adnan brought up, and I was kind of really particularly interested in maybe the parallels between Mormon ideas of kind of racial purity and holiness and what you were talking towards the end about like white Buddhists or metaphysical Buddhists. But I don't know if you had more to add, but I thought that was quite curious, and also it seemed to align with the time period in terms of when like Mormon theology and Joseph Smith was coming up. My other question was more towards the latter part, and this is more towards kind of categories that that scholars have come up with in terms of Buddhism. I'm thinking about like white Buddhism and like traditional Buddhism and ethnic Buddhism, and I'm kind of fascinated by these labels and categories. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more, and you probably ran out of time towards the end, but like say a little bit more about it, partly because I kind of use the trajectory of Buddhist studies to think about Sufism in America as well. And so since Sufism is kind of a much younger field compared to Buddhism, I tend to have drawn a lot. So I usually talk to David McMahon, for instance, about how he thinks about Buddhism and the struggle of kind of thinking about white Sufis or white Buddhists and what's lost and what's not lost in that. Mm-hmm. And so I usually do look to Buddhist studies to see how they're dealing with these categories. And I think some of the research that you've presented is really destabilizing some of those categories, because there's like a longer lineage of like whiteness is problematic and like how the East is constructing Aryanness. So I wonder if you could just say some more on what you think about these categories. You're kind of alluding to some reflections, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So through the history of Buddhist studies, like especially trying to describe Buddhism in America, they've come across this problem where they try to like parse out or separate who is involved, but in doing so, it becomes more problematic through the typology. So it kind of started with like two Buddhisms. Charles Prebish did like ethnic Buddhism versus modern Buddhism. Um, and then it became three Buddhisms, which was import, export, and baggage Buddhists. And so baggage was really the one where Jan Nattier got hammered a lot, because it was meant to mean like Buddhists sort of packed up their religion in their bags, carried it, and just brought it to America and dropped their suitcases, and that was that. And so of course it's much more complicated than that, right? And so these histories definitely nuance those discussions about like who was ethnic, who was traditional, who was modern, because we can see differences in this time period of like Buddhists were not ethnic and they were not traditional, they were scientific according to the time period. They were trying to modernize, that's what they were doing. So you can see these like immediate complications in these typologies. And even like then people would say, well, what about generationally? Because there was also like, we started referring to convert Buddhists. Well, like what if you're not Japanese American but your parents were Buddhist? You're not a convert Buddhist. Like these complications all sort of came up. And so what I'm personally kind of finding is that they are describing the separation between Caucasian Buddhists and Asian Buddhists. They were trying to describe it in various ways. They were trying to describe it as they're importing, they're exporting. That what they were describing is segregation. They're describing two separate races doing two separate things. So they were trying to put like an academic typology to that, but really what they were describing is segregation. And so I think, although like my time period, I might even label it as like an era of Aryan Buddhism or Aryan Buddhism at the time. Today, I certainly wouldn't say like American Buddhism is Aryan Buddhism. They don't think about it that way and they're not promoting it that way. But this historical trajectory has continued to influence the way that they're still segregated in a lot of cases. And not by design, but just by being interested in different things through racecraft, these sorts of things, that we've had this separation.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Yeah.
I see another hand. Xiaomin Zhu. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Apologies.
I go by Jessica, sorry. I should
Jessica.
have changed my screen name. Thank you, Ryan. This is such a fascinating talk. I hope I just read your dissertation much earlier. But I think my question is mostly coming from ignorance, because my research is mostly on modern Chinese Buddhism. So this is just like totally new. And mine was reading about, mindfulness, this kind of thing going on in America. One book I particularly get interested in is Mind Cure by Professor Shannon, I hope I pronounced her name,
Hickey, yeah.
And then according to her, right, those kind of mindfulness is really just like a late 19th, early 20th century woman instructed by kind of a Buddhist Hindu missionary. So it's a kind of a syncretic spirituality, but they use Buddhist meditation and Hindu meditation techniques, and they believe that transforming consciousness helped them cure their kind of trauma because of the oppression. So I'm just trying to see like what is the relationship between this strain of thought about mindfulness and what you just told me now, totally new knowledge, and what you think is actually going on. Are they because is the segregation in America? So you see two streams of mindfulness merged together, but where does women fit? Like I don't like some of the women are definitely white women promoting mind cure. So just want your expert insight on this.
Sure. Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. I think so. There is some connection between my time period and modern mindfulness, but in my time period, the discussion of meditation practice is actually very rudimentary and not as present as we might assume. In this time period, there's still mostly discussion of doctrines. and like Buddhist doctrines and whether they're correct or whether we should reinterpret them. And there's not as much discussion about practice.
Even Suzuki, T.D. Suzuki doesn't.
So Suzuki, there's some discussion of practice, but not as a way of like instruction. It's practice as in how it affects you spiritually. Practice involved in Jiriki and Tariki, these types of discussions. We don't have like a guide for mindfulness, it seems, at this time period. So I think the historical connection for my research and modern mindfulness would be this idea of like white privilege and some white supremacy. But the major developments, I think, in modern mindfulness come a bit later, 1950s, 1960s, that era. As far as the involvement of women in this particularly, I think this could be actually a really interesting sort of side article for me as well, because especially in the metaphysical Buddhist circles, women were very involved. Writers, they're authors of these magazines, authors of these texts throughout, women contributing like poetry excerpts throughout the magazines. So the voice of women in those metaphysical Western Buddhist magazines is definitely there. So that would be something to look at more closely and interpret, but they're involved in the discussion of Aryanizing Buddhism for sure, and especially through the Theosophical Society.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I see Alicia Turner.
Hi.
Hi, Dr. Turner.
Hi, it's wonderful to have you here. I'm your colleague at York, and it's really great to see more Buddhist studies, and especially this kind of time period Buddhist studies in Ontario. So
Great.
Very cool, and thank you for your talk. This was really
Thank you.
fun. I work on a really similar kind of time period, but mostly in colonial Burma, and asking these kind of questions in places like that. And I really like the way in which you're tracing a discourse of Aryan through different conversations in different places. And I'm thinking about, in part, what your talk was getting me to think about with how is the similar trope of Aryan used for different fights or different positions at different spots, right? And how was it used antagonistically towards different things? So, like when you're talking about Dharmapala using it, and like the things you had from like the 1920s, they're really anti-Semitic,
Right.
which is interesting because some of the work I do was about a decade earlier. A figure I work with was working with Dharmapala, and they were really anti-Christian. And it's interesting. What is the other thing a proxy for, and what does it get you, right? So there are moments, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, when being anti-Christian is being anti-British, right? So you can't be seditious, but you can be anti-Christian.
Right.
Then there's a moment when saying, no, we're Aryan, so we're more like Christianity, and thus we deserve to be treated better than other colonized figures. What we're trying to do is move ourselves up in ranks. And those dynamics are slightly different in set there than they are, say, the Japanese case, in which they're making internal Japanese conversations are constructing their own kinds of imperialisms. And that gets completely reversed yet again when it gets to the US. And so sort of thinking about that, thinking, where does the Aryan go become anti-Semitic? Where does it become anti-Catholic, as opposed to anti-Christian? Like all those questions really made me also think, like, where do you see the intersections with the kind of work Tomoko Masazawa has done on world religions categories? Like, what is Aryan? I mean, given that this is, right, Aryan category is clearly deeply involved in exactly the philological work she's doing, and what I find fascinating is that she really constructs Buddhism and Islam as these twin productions, as opposed, it's constructed opposed to each other. So yeah, can you say more about how Aryan is used by different groups at different places and where it fits in the construction of religions? And thank you, this is really fun stuff. This is great.
Excellent, thanks. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, the Aryan myth is sort of present in sources like dating back to even the 1850s and before. And of course, it's present in Buddhism as the term Aryan, meaning noble. I think for Dharmapala, the way we see that change is actually in the shift in time period. So early Dharmapala would be more anti-Christian. However, it was through this bio-racism that they said, well, the opposite of the Aryans are the Semites. They're the negative side of that. And so anti-Semitism gained a certain scientific mode prior to World War II. And so it was actually this turn where Dharmapala is doing similar things, anti-British sentiment, anti-colonial sentiment, but now instead of just being anti-Christian as a code for anti-British, there's now a science there. We are the Aryans and you are the Semites, and it's proven by science, and it's connected to Jesus through his Semitic origins. So Christianity becomes Semitic and therefore downgraded by tying it to the Semites, and and that sort of idea actually spreads throughout Asia with the spread of bioracism and eugenics. We also see, I think it's the king of Thailand. I think it's in Thailand where he refers to the Chinese as the Jews of Asia. And then also in Japan, you get writings of Buddhist monks about like how the Jews are bringing about the end of the world in like the 1930s. I know Brian Victoria writes about some of that. So even in like this sort of spread of anti-Semitism, I think has a lot less to do with like Jewish people in particular, and much more to do with their particular view of like bioracism and turning that sort of anti-Semitism into an almost anti-white, anti-colonial trope, right? Where the bad white people are labeled as Jewish, and therefore that sort of anti-Semitism can permeate. And it further connected them with American culture, which was deeply anti-Semitic at this time, right? It was in the 1920s where they stopped letting Jewish students attend universities in the United States. So this is a period of deep anti-Semitism in the United States, as well as a way for Asians to tie their Buddhism further to racism. So I think that's the sort of change over time that you see, where it just becomes more ingrained with science and Westernization and modernism. Thanks.
Well, we're almost at 4 o'clock, and Ryan has given us so much to think about and talk about. We'll be digesting, I think, your talk and its implications for a while. We had a terrific discussion afterwards as well. So, this video will be available on the School of Religion YouTube channel, and it's available as soon as this ends. It'll be available on our Facebook site. So if you want to share it, if you want others to be able to hear about this, please do connect them to those platforms through us. And we'll also be having some future talks next term. Probably not another one this term, but next term. So do look out for other future presentations and so on from the School of Religion. But why don't we thank Ryan again for a really wonderful presentation and answering so many great questions. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.